It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, filling in for Brian today. Coming up later in the show, Brooklyn City Council member Lincoln Ressler will be here to explain the ins and outs of his new bill on year-round outdoor dining. After its pandemic-era high, the program was restricted heavily during the Adams administration. But Council member Ressler's plan would expand outdoor dining again. Plus, we'll take on the tender topic, which is learning about the differences between postpartum psychiatric conditions, including postpartum psychosis, an extremely but rare and serious condition. My guest will talk about why postpartum healthcare, especially mental health, is so neglected in this country and what to look out for. And we'll wrap today's show with a question for all of you. What's your personal AI policy? Do you have any self-imposed ground rules when using chatbots like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, or any of the other ones? It's a whole new world out there, so we're going to talk about your personal AI policies at the end of today's show. But we're going to kick things off with some national politics. Midterm election years are historically bad news for the party that holds the presidency. President Trump is acutely aware of that. Earlier this week, when asked by a conservative commentator whether he might declare a state of emergency to take control of elections, he said, quote, "Stranger things have happened." So that's one take on democracy. Another comes from the millions of people casting ballots to pick their candidates in some very high-profile primary races this summer, races that could help determine who controls the House, the Senate, the governorship of several crucial swing states. Just this week, there were primaries in 6 states, including key Midwestern battlegrounds. And, big surprise, the results were not quite what the polls were predicting. And for Democrats who are trying to firm up their brand identity ahead of the 2028 presidential contest, party moderates said they showed they can still put up a fight. So we're going to unpack some of these key races this morning, the winners and losers, and what it means for the midterms with 2 reporters. Rachel Leingang is a Midwest political correspondent for Guardian U.S. based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Teo Armus is a reporter at the Washington Post covering midterm elections. Rachel, Teo, welcome to WNYC.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
And listeners, we want to hear directly from you, particularly Democratic voters. A lot of the post-race analysis has focused on what these results say about the identity of the Democratic Party. So I want to hear your take. Do you want more socialists and progressives to carry the party's flag, or is the Big Tent Party better off sticking with more moderate or centrist Democrats? Do we have any listeners from Wisconsin or Minnesota in particular who want to help shed some light on what happened on the ground there this week? You can call us at 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. We can take your calls or texts. I want to start with Wisconsin and that gubernatorial primary that, continues to be the talk of many of our cable news friends. It's the latest test of the Democratic Socialist wing of the party against the moderate center. So let's bring our listeners up to speed about the candidates and what was at stake there. Rachel, can you talk a little bit about the differences between these candidates? We've got DSA-backed state lawmaker Francesca Hong and the Milwaukee County executive David Crowley.
Yeah, what a race that was. Truly unique, like one I've really never seen. So there were multiple candidates. I mean, at the end of the day, 4 people were still running. So the main 2, Francesca Hong and David Crowley. Hong was really the front runner for most of that race. And I would say that in itself is a real sign of the party's big changes in the last couple years. The fact that a Democratic Socialist was a front runner in a gubernatorial race in Wisconsin, I think really showcases where a lot of Democratic primary voters are in a way that, and if she ran in 2024, she might have taken 3rd or 4th place. She really, in the last 2 weeks of the race, got a lot of negative headlines for previous tweets, including one where she said Thanksgiving should be canceled. And there were always a ton of undecided voters in that race. And so those undecided folks are tuning in at a time when she's experiencing, attention that mostly skewed negative. And I think that got a lot of people very concerned. So it looked like most of those undecided folks moved toward David Crowley. He is a Milwaukee County executive, and he focused a lot on getting things done. He himself had previously dropped out of the race. He got back in the race, which is a rarity. And he got an endorsement from Governor Tony Evers and just barnstormed the state in the last couple weeks. And it worked, which I think is wild. I mean, it was a wild night of watching results and really an incredibly close race. The third and fourth place candidates took more votes than the gap between the top two. So wild times in Wisconsin. And I think like for voters, it was pretty confusing. I think throughout when I talked with voters on the ground, they were often really struggling with where to go with it.
So let's hear a little bit of the voices from these candidates for our listeners who maybe haven't been following these races quite as closely. First, I want to play a clip from Francesca Wong from her election night party. Let's take a listen.
I know we don't have the final results right now, but what I do know is that we are ready to keep fighting, and I feel confident. But more importantly, I am so deeply, deeply grateful to my core for how hard you have all fought and for what this fight, our movement, means for all of Wisconsin.
Again, that was state lawmaker Francesca Hong at her election night party. Let's hear from David Crowley.
So let me say this clearly. This election is not about insiders versus outsiders. It's not about the establishment versus progressives. It's about building something bigger than any one campaign. It's about building a movement, y'all. A movement that reaches every corner of Wisconsin.
Teo, I want to bring you into this conversation. When I listen to those clips, I hear them both talking about their respective movements. Moderate Democrats seem to really be celebrating this win as something of a rejection of the progressive wing of the party, specifically of the DSA. What are you hearing from Democrats about this result?
Yeah, I mean, it is and it is not a rejection, I would say. I think the fact that there was such a close result between the two is something that I think, both parties are focusing on, or I should say both wings of the party, as well as Republicans, are certainly focusing on. A lot of DSA leaders in Wisconsin who I talked to yesterday very much said, it's really incredible, as Rachel, I think, pointed out earlier, that, someone like Francesca Hong, who was not very well known, prior to running in this election and was at, the very beginning of the race polling really, really low, managed to get as close as she did. And they're sort of interpreting that as not quite a victory, but something close to it. On the flip side, I think folks in the sort of more mainstream wing of the party, they won, right? And ultimately it's about winning, whether that's very narrow or by a much wider gap. They're certainly celebrating that, but I think a lot of people are also very much taking stock of the fact that, voters in Wisconsin are hungry for change and hungry for this sort of fighting spirit and anti-establishment spirit that I think, a DSA candidate like Francesca Hong really, really presents. The other thing, I would also sort of point out that I think is maybe being lost in some of the conversation is that, David Crowley is not a democratic socialist, but I would also not, consider him a centrist by any means. He's certainly more mainstream, right? He received, this sort of last minute endorsement from Governor Tony Evers, but on a lot of issues, some people would consider him maybe not quite a progressive, but, kind of leaning towards it, right? And I think that in and of itself is also sort of an interesting sign of where the party's going, where if you were to, turn back the clock a couple of years, if he wins in November, that might also be a statement about where the party is headed, particularly in the Midwest and particularly in, these battleground states like Wisconsin.
That's so interesting. Rachel, a listener texted in, it should be pointed out that Francesca Hong said that Thanksgiving might want to be canceled during the 2020 pandemic. Without that context, it's just thoroughly misleading and playing into Republican efforts to discredit Democrats. You mentioned that tweet and that news cycle that kind of hit her at the end of that particular primary race. Can you unpack it a little bit more and respond to that listener's text?
Sure. Yeah, these are old tweets. They're from 6 and 7 years ago. And several of them were brought up in interviews where it's not necessarily the old tweet that had people concerned, but maybe her responses to it, at least initially, her responses were not as sharp as they could be. And I mean, I think we saw that evolve over time, where, she eventually got to the point of just saying, no, I don't want to cancel Thanksgiving, and moving on, or moving to a topic she did want to talk about, which I think that's what people wanted to see. That I think there is an acceptance that a lot of candidates probably have old tweets that they're not proud of. Probably a lot of people have those at this point, especially anything that happened in 2020. I do think people are forgiving of that, but you have to be able to respond sharply to it and move your message forward. And I think that's what was lost initially in her responses to it. So it's not like just the tweet. It's how do you respond to these previous positions when you're running a different race and in a different context than you were in 2020.
Let's bring in some of our callers. Daniel in Manhattan. Daniel, you're on WNYC.
I thank you so much. A little background. My father was a state senator in Michigan, in Oakland County. And my cousin is a powerful circuit court judge there, elected. I know a lot about Michigan. I grew up there. I'm in Manhattan. I stay in touch with them, all my friends and family and voters there. We have a bit of a fuzziness here in that I believe, the Democratic Party is evolving always, and it's moving. You want to call it to the left? I think it's just becoming more democratic and less corporate Democrats and less conservative Democrats, which you want to call centrist. But I think we have a major problem in this country, both like in Wisconsin and Michigan. Those are what we call Raider primaries or open primaries. So what I heard from some voter friends in Michigan, because, even though I'm a lifelong Democrat, I have friends who are Republicans, and some of them said they were going to go and vote and raid the primary and vote for El Sayed just to confuse the whole picture. So there, as your reporters there, how much do they know in exit pollings that were Democrats voting for Democrats and not Republicans crossing over and vice versa? I don't ever think we're going to get a clear answer on how voters are thinking as long as we have these Raider primaries or open primaries and not safe or closed primaries. I'd like to hear their opinion. Thank you.
Daniel, thanks so much for that call, but also for raising that issue, because one of the things that we certainly talk about a lot on this show and here at WNYC is about how primaries are conducted, and it is an important distinction because here in New York State we have a closed primary system. Only registered members of a party holding a primary are allowed to participate. So, Rachel or Teo, can you talk about how those primaries were held in Wisconsin and in some of these other Midwestern states that we're going to touch on?
Yeah, I would just say I talked with a pollster about this yesterday because I think that's always a concern that people have of people crossing over. And he was saying, poli-sci 101, most people don't gamify voting like that. They vote for who they like, and they vote for who they think is the best candidate. So while there were, I think this pollster estimated in Wisconsin, for instance, about 10% of Republicans who voted in the Democratic primary, they mostly voted for who they liked. So they voted, in this case, for Crowley. And I do, in talking with voters, they're thinking a lot, when they're voting in their own primaries, they're thinking a lot about electability, but they're not thinking of gamifying in a way where they're going to cross over and pick a candidate they perceive as less electable, and then not vote for who they like. It's just not something that happens in a scale that I think is changing elections in any kind of way.
I think that
Go ahead, Teo.
I was just going to say, I think that definitely makes sense. And the only other thing I would really point out is, you have to remember that beyond these sort of marquee statewide races, there were also some, fairly competitive congressional primaries for the U.S. House on both sides of the aisle. And, of course, if you live in one of those districts and want to vote in one of those races, you have to vote, either in the GOP or the Democratic primary there, right? You can't sort of cross over for one, part of your ballot, and then, vote on the other side for the other part of the ballot. So that, may also be something that is worth thinking about, that ultimately keeps people on their side of the aisle for the primary.
Teo, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about the Republican candidate Crowley will now be facing in November.
Yeah, so Representative Tom Tiffany, I think, is largely considered one of the more, if not the most conservative member of Wisconsin's congressional delegation. He voted to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. He's a member of the House Freedom Caucus, which, of course, is sort of the kind of most hardline, conservative caucus among Republicans. He also signed on to a 6-week abortion ban, for example. So he is largely seen as someone who I think is very representative of that kind of furthest right wing of the Republican Party. He definitely seems to be moderating a little bit ahead of the November election. He actually released an ad on election day in which he's sort of talking about himself as this very common sense problem solver, and I think sort of really trying to appeal to the middle, right? Independents, maybe centrists, moderate Democrats who might have been turned off by someone like Francesca Hong. But it'll be a really interesting contrast. I think Republicans were very much expecting to run up against someone like Hong, in a race where you would have sort of really seen kind of the far ends of both parties come out. And David Crowley is maybe throwing them a little bit of a curveball, although, from what I've heard, they say that they have some stuff up their sleeves, with regards to his leadership in Milwaukee County at this point.
Interesting. More stories to come there, no doubt. A listener texted, voting for Crowley instead of Hong isn't rejecting progressiveness, it's pragmatism. Whoever wins the primary has to be able to win votes from non-Dems as well as Dems. It's important to choose the person who has a better chance of appealing to, quote, regular Wisconsinites. Rachel, given the way that Teo was just describing, Tiffany as a candidate and the way he, sort of is to the far right of the party, I'm just wondering, how much do you sort of think that voters were taking that pragmatic approach when they were thinking about this statewide race?
I think swing state voters are especially attuned to this. They're Wisconsin in particular, incredibly close statewide races. And really, they go any which way every other year. So I do think they really pay attention to wanting to win statewide. And there, in this case, are two really big things on the line. Democrats want a trifecta in state government. They want the governor's office and the legislature because they've been in divided government for a while, and they really want an ability to move an agenda forward. So that's the local context. The national context is Wisconsin is key to the 2028 presidential map. And Tom Tiffany, declined to certify the 2020 results. So I do think people are very keen that they don't want somebody in the Democratic primary. They're very keen that they don't want somebody like Tiffany with that record on elections in a position like the governor's office in 2028 as well. So I think in talking with voters, they were thinking about those things. It's very much on their minds. And for some, they kind of landed on, I think anyone could beat Tiffany. They didn't necessarily think he was a super strong candidate in a general. But I think in the final weeks when a lot of undecideds figured out where to go, that was probably top of mind for them.
Teo, were you hearing similar concerns from voters when you were on the ground?
Yeah, so we I have a colleague who actually lives in Madison, Wisconsin, who I think was doing the bulk of sort of our reporting with voters there. But one of the things that I think he really heard, particularly in the last couple days of the election, right, was from, I would say, sort of the most undecided, but also maybe the most tuned in kinds of voters, right? Folks who are highly educated, maybe sort of at the higher end of the income spectrum. That sort of cancel Thanksgiving news cycle, that was really apparent on like a Fox News, for example. did I think really turn people off and sort of make them worry that someone like Francesca Hong simply would just not be able to win. One thing I've heard often that I think is really interesting is that Wisconsin is not really a purple state; it's a very blue state and a very red state. You just sort of have all these different pockets that coexist sort of under one state map, and ultimately I think Democratic Socialists would sort of make the argument that someone like Hong would actually be able to turn out the base, and really excite people in a way that someone like David Crowley would not. But I think those last 2 weeks or so really hurt her, right? And I think maybe started to get some people to doubt whether that would be possible. Even people who maybe, ideologically or on principle would in fact align themselves with Hong a little bit more. I think, we heard from some voters who said she has really great ideas, right? Like I agree with her much more on the policy front, particularly on data centers, which is sort of a big rift, I would say, between Hong and Crowley. But ultimately, I have to sort of vote with that word we hear all the time, right? Electability. I have to vote with electability in mind.
I want to go to a break in just a moment, but before we do, we haven't really talked about how what the issues the candidates were kind of centering in their campaigns. And, Rachel, I wonder if you could just give us the thumbnail of how each candidate was positioning themselves to the electorate.
Yeah, as Teo just mentioned, data center is a huge issue. So for Hong, she had her position was a 1-year moratorium on data center construction, and that was a clearer position than the other Democrats in the field, who all want some sort of additional checks and balances on data centers, but hers was a simple moratorium. She also really centered around affordability and the idea of childcare for all, improved state Medicaid programs, access, things like that. And then Crowley, his campaign in the last couple of weeks is just generally centered on, I think I can win more people over in a general election. But his platform is, I would say, like fairly similar to Hong's, just less, maybe a little bit less progressive. He also talked a lot about affordability. He said voters are constantly bringing that up to him. And I do think like in most races this year, that is the main thing people are talking about: healthcare, cost of gas, cost of childcare, and they want people who are going to have ways to address that quickly.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian Lehrer. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back with much more from my guests, Rachel Leingang, and Midwest political correspondent for Guardian U.S., and Teo Armus, reporter at the Washington Post, covering the midterm elections as we unpack what the results mean. And we have a whole board of your calls. We can't wait to get to them. Stick around. We'll be right back. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian today. My guests are Rachel Leingang, a Midwest political correspondent for Guardian U.S., and Teo Armus, a reporter at the Washington Post covering the midterm elections. We're talking about the fallout from this week's midterm primaries with a special focus on Wisconsin and Minnesota. We have a bunch of calls, and I want to bring in some of our listeners. Let's start with Todd in Manhattan. Todd, you're on WNYC. Todd, are you there?
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead, Todd.
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry. I wanted to object to the framing of the conversation, and it's a framing that's going on in many journalistic outlets. And at the top of the hour, or top of the section, you talked about identity was used, as if there's one stable and fixed, essential, reductive democratic identity that we were trying to figure out that's going on, that's, identifiable and lasting, or at least lasting through the midterms in the country. And I think what we may be seeing, and first of all, I think that's not necessarily true that exists. and that's framing everything like that may in fact impose the reality that it pretends to be trying to observe. So maybe we're looking at diversity and not division, that there are more progressive candidates in one place for one kind of job with one kind of individual, and more moderate candidates in another place. And the question is really not, perhaps our shock, maybe this is animated by a shock in this Trumpian period over the fact that there could actually be diversity of opinion and that not everybody in a party could submit to one single idea or one single policy. So I think the framing is corrosive. And a better question is if the office holder who's more progressive in one place eventually will cooperate with the office holder in another place who's more moderate towards anti-Trumpism and towards a better world, or not.
Sure. And
that would be a better subject to analyze than trying to identify some unstable identity of the Democrat today.
Todd, I appreciate your perspective. I would push back a little bit and say, do you think that the Democrats will have an identity going into the 2028 presidential election and that any of these races may contribute to some of that?
It doesn't, I mean, I don't think it needs an identity. The identity could be anti-Trumpism, right? And it may translate in one way, in one kind of language in one place, and another in another place. So what?
Todd, thanks so much for calling. We appreciate it. Keep listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Let's go to Dan in Manhattan. Dan, you're on WNYC.
Hi. It seems to me like the win, or I guess the race in Wisconsin, was unequivocally a win for DSA, given the narrow margin of loss there. And I guess I'm wondering, we're seeing kind of a decoupling or attempted decoupling by DSA candidates from previous kind of hot-button culture war issues like we've seen with El Sayed refusing that he's ever said defund the police, with AOC saying woke one was crazy recently. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you square them, DSA candidates, kind of capitalizing on the popularity of the economic side while what I feel is disingenuously kind of rejecting their previous views, which, in my opinion, are hard to decouple from the platform when it's all based on intersectionality, et cetera.
Dan, thanks.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Teo. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a really, interesting question and an interesting observation. I mean, I think it's something that I've, done quite a bit of reporting on DSA and its endorsed candidates, particularly this year. And I think it's something that a lot of candidates and, the organization itself is struggling and kind of grappling with, right? I mean, a DSA candidate in New York City is running in a very different sort of environment compared to a DSA candidate somewhere like Wisconsin, for example. But it's tough, right? I mean, I thought it was really interesting, for instance, Danielisa Avila Chevalier, who is running in sort of Upper Manhattan in the Bronx. She talked a lot about sort of redirecting funding, right, from wars overseas towards social programs. Her campaign was called, or sort of one of her policy platforms was Babies Not Bombs.
Sure.
That's, certainly one way to frame it, that maybe gets at both of those things. I do think it gets really tricky when you have Republicans on the other side of the aisle who are basically trying to brand any sort of left of center Democrat as a communist, right? And when you have cable news, showing clips of Francesca Hong talking about Thanksgiving, like pretty much on a loop in the week before the election. You also do have, some wings of DSA, some Democratic Socialists who actually, want AOC and want Zoran Mamdani and want Francesca Hong to double down on their past views and beliefs and sort of really hold firm, right? Hold the line, even if there is pressure for them to moderate as they sort of climb the ranks of elected office. So it's a tough thing, and I think they're sort of still figuring it out. I'm curious to see how that plays out, moving ahead towards November and even beyond that.
Sure. I think one of the points also raised by our previous caller, Todd, that was so interesting is that there has been kind of an obsession across the media with trying to understand what these results mean in a broader context for the national party. And yet, obviously, these are state races. These are single federal primaries in congressional districts that can look very different than perhaps what you might see across an entire state, or certainly in a primary that is a national primary. The electorate themselves are different in all of these places. In your piece, Teo, you looked at some of the different turnout dynamics in this particular primary in Wisconsin. We know here in New York, that race that you mentioned, there was huge turnout among young voters, and that was one of the driving factors that helped support some of the DSA candidates. Can you tell us a little about who voted in this Wisconsin primary and how that vote split? Was age really the deciding factor, or was it more about geography, the rural, suburban, urban voter?
Yeah, so I would really say just across the board and across the different demographics that we looked at and analyzed, Crowley really managed to hold Francesca Hung's margins pretty slim numbers across the board in the areas where Democratic Socialists have tended to perform best across the country, whether that's in New York or Michigan or in Denver. DSA candidates sort of tend to perform best with high but not the highest income voters, young voters, as you mentioned, and then also especially sort of the most highly educated voters. If you crunch the numbers in Wisconsin, Hung won all those groups, but she did so very narrowly. Compared to sort of some of the other DSA victories that we've seen in places like New York, those groups just split tremendously towards Democratic Socialists. Crowley did better in Milwaukee, which is the one big metro in Wisconsin, and in the suburbs. Hung won kind of small cities across the state, but again, she just narrowly won these most educated counties. Barely won the counties with the most young adults. So that kind of advantage, if you will, that Democratic Socialists had in other races, whether congressional or Senate races, or mayoral races, even across the country, that really, really aggressively supported DSA candidates, was not quite one that Hung really was able to benefit from as much as she needed to.
Rachel, I want to shift gears for a moment. You are based in Minneapolis, and so I want to talk about the results in Minnesota in that Senate primary there. Just for background, can you talk about that race, who the candidates were, and what was their pitch to voters there?
Sure. So this is an open U.S. Senate seat, and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan was running against a moderate U.S. Representative Angie Craig, who represents a purplish district. And, as the caller mentioned, who was talking about, different people of different places have different contours of the race. This one, interestingly, centered very much on immigration, on ICE, because of what everyone here experienced during Operation Metro Surge. So Craig had previously voted for the Laken-Riley Act, and that it really, she said she regretted it, but that really, I think, became a central theme of Flanagan's when she ran, was, she's out of touch with where we are on ICE. And given what we've all gone through, it did seem to be the main factor. But also, this is a bluer state than Wisconsin and Michigan. So I think the margin here was much more than I expected going into it, that Flanagan won pretty decisively. But I think the criticism from, I believe his name was Todd, the caller, was very fair. I'm a big believer in many different things in many different places. Each race is its own thing, and local voters have different needs, different wants from what their candidates are offering. The one truism that I've seen in all of these races across the Midwest is basically anti-establishment, anti-status quo. People are very sick of pretty much anything happening in DC, seemingly from both parties. And so if there is one animating force in the primaries right now, it's that.
Taking that into account, Flanagan is now going to go on to face Michelle Tafoya, if I have that right, a Republican former and she's a former National Football League sideline reporter in November. Tell us about the dynamics of that general election.
Yeah, it was interesting this year. Republicans, I think, in both the primary for U.S. Senate and in the primary for our open governor's seat, where Amy Klobuchar is the Democratic candidate, they chose more mainstream Republicans over far-right options that were on the ballot, which doesn't always happen here. So it seemed like there was a pragmatism in their choices as well. Like Tafoya, for instance, is a pro-choice Republican. She believes in abortion up to a certain abortion access up to a certain point. So that differed from the other Republican candidates. And then in our gubernatorial primary, Mike Lindell, the pillow guy, who is like a central figure in the election denial movement, he was endorsed by Trump, but he lost his race pretty handily to Lisa Dameth, who is our House Speaker here, and a person with governing experience and a much more mainstream Republican than Mike Lindell would be. And I will note, like, predictably, Lindell is not accepting the results of that election, but it just showed a pragmatism on the right that isn't always present. I will say the odds are on the side of the Democrats here just because of our voting history. Statewide, a Republican hasn't won statewide since 2006. So and in a wave year for Democrats, they're the odds-on favorites for these races.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the Republican gubernatorial primary. I was going to get to that next, but you've mentioned the pillow guy, so I think we've covered that ground. I want to bring in another caller who's wants to weigh in on the Wisconsin race again. Let's go to Sam in Queens. Sam, you're on WNYC.
I'm a native New Yorker, but I lived in Milwaukee for half a decade. I just moved back to Queens from Milwaukee, so I'm still very close to Wisconsin, to the area. I taught at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I feel very I understand a little bit of what's going on there, and I think that it feels like there's just a bit of a lack of maybe feet on the ground or knowing of like the direction or the mindset of the voter in Wisconsin, the Democratic voter. I think the state itself is actually shifting very far to the left. It's a state that's still reeling very much from Scott Walker. I mean, I don't think we talk enough about just how much damage the governor, Scott Walker, did to the state of Wisconsin and how much resistance there was to him and how he, really turned it from this really rich state that had such strong labor identity to one that just was completely stripped of all of its sort of labor sort of strength, becoming a right-to-work, an Act 10 state. But I think that she did not run, when I say she, Francesca Hung, she didn't run the best campaign. And I think that actually they wanted someone like her, truth be told. But aside from the scandals, she didn't even have the money to really, put more ads on television. And there is still a lot of old people in Milwaukee who do watch television. Those TV ads do make a difference, especially towards the end. And a lot of Wisconsin voters will hold their sort of opinions to themselves till the very end. But it's moving left. And I do think that the narrative that it's they don't want DSA, I just don't think that's true. I think she just got unlucky with the fact that in Dane County and in Madison, the students are gone. Had there been more students there, I think she would have easily won. Had the primary just been literally a few weeks from now when students arrived, we wouldn't be talking about Crowley as this insurgent candidate, who, by the way, as the chief county executive of Milwaukee, he's not a good politician. Having lived there, it's Crowley's a bit of a joke. He's not really progressive. He's not really anything. He doesn't really have much to run off of. I will acknowledge that I'm more left politically than Crowley, but the only reason he managed to sneak in with this bare eke of a win was because of Tony Evers' endorsement at the last second, and also name recognition. People in Milwaukee just know his name.
Sure.
Hong is not as familiar, and really it's...
Well, Sam, I'm going to jump in just because we're running out of time in this segment, and you raised some really interesting points that I want to get Rachel and Teo to react to, specifically the idea of the timing of the race and the role students may or may not have could have played in the outcome. I wonder if that's something that people are talking about when they look at this, the analysis of the results so far. Teo?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about a race that's won by
yeah,
a few
no,
thousand
I mean
votes, all of
that's
those
certainly a good
things,
point.
yeah.
It's a point that I have heard as well. I will say, I mean, I think to your broader point, right? Crowley won by a very, very narrow margin, right? And so I think it is well taken, and anyone looking at the results closely is hopefully coming away with the same conclusion you are, right? That Wisconsin voters probably are hungry for that kind of, further left, sort of more populist, fighter approach that she really presented. This particular time, obviously, it didn't work out, and that might be because of a lack of student votes or any number of other reasons. The fact that she wasn't on TV, that she sort of struggled with funding in her campaign. But the results, I think, speak for themselves, and the fact that she even got this close is a really, really good point. So I hear you on that.
As we wrap up here, Rachel, I'd love to hear some of your closing thoughts as we're sort of peering into our political crystal balls about what is going to matter ahead of the November election. What are some of the themes that you're going to be continuing to report on, and some of the issues you think that are going to be really driving voters ahead of November?
I do want to hear from Democratic candidates about their plans for how to actually solve affordability, because it's one thing to talk about this as a major concern for voters, but you have to come through with some kind of proactive platform. And I think we're seeing that in the form of, in El Sayed's case, he's running on Medicare for all. I think voters really want, what are you going to do? Because nothing is working right now. And so that's what they're articulating, and how candidates respond to that, I think it needs to be really sharp. The other thing is, people are very fed up with money in politics, a sense of corruption. And I think those issues are something Democrats need to speak directly to as well. We've seen it in the primaries, but I think that we'll see more of that in the general. And then, several of your callers have mentioned this, but this idea of like the Democratic tent, I think is something that I'm curious to see how it plays out, because there are many different factions of the party in many different places, and how they come together in a fall election at a time when we're seeing, a large rise in democratic socialism, I think will be, really worth watching.
Teo, closing thought?
Yeah, I will continue to sort of be looking at the rise of the DSA, I think, in the Democratic Party. We do have sort of a couple of more primaries left in the cycle. There's a couple of DSA candidates in Florida in that primary next week. I do agree. I think Michigan is probably going to be one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting, sort of statewide race, looking at November. But, it will be sort of a very, I think, interesting signal, if you will, of how voters are feeling ahead of the 2028 presidential election. I very much sort of hear what I think an earlier caller talked about Democrats having all different sorts of tendencies, if you will, and they're beating many different directions. Unfortunately, there can only be one presidential candidate, right? And that person is going to have views and a profile that might differ a little bit from some other wings of the party. So I think the midterms are also going to offer some hopefully really interesting clues about what type of candidate voters are really looking for.
Well, it sounds like no rest for the weary politics reporters. My guests have been Rachel Leingang, the Midwest political correspondent for Guardian U.S., and Teo Armus, a reporter at the Washington Post covering the midterm elections. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.